Welcome Rotarians and guests to the Rotary Club of Seattle, the fourth oldest and one of the world's largest Rotary clubs, where we embrace service above self and are connecting for good. Today, we recognize our place in the world and the vital relationships that we enjoy and that we value with nations around the globe. Today, we are going to celebrate the diplomatic and consular representatives in our region who, together with other diplomacy champions, help foster and promote better understanding and goodwill. One of them is our member, Pedro Costa, who's the honorary consul from Brazil and serving this year as the president of the Consular Association of Washington. Pedro's going to offer us some Brazilian inspiration, and then immediately following, please remain standing because our trumpeter in residence, Arnie Ness, is going to serenade us. So Pedro.
Should I speak in Portuguese? Ken asked me to. Okay. Oh, as my Facebook friends have noticed, I spent some time in Jerusalem this past month. If you walk into the old city, you suddenly can be in the Jewish quarter, or in the Christian quarter, or in the Muslim quarter, or in the Armenian quarter. Our guide told us to stay together at all times for security reasons, but perhaps during my aging process, or maybe because I was born without a GPS, I found myself lost in seconds. My wife calls me a Zelig, the Woody Allen character who could mold his personality in different personalities. That's exactly what happened to me in Jerusalem. In minutes, I became a Jew, a Christian, a Palestinian, a Brazilian, an American. I could be whatever I want to be. I could be whoever people see me as. Lost in that heavy labyrinth of faith, I start to experience intense freedom. After a while, I found myself in the place where Jesus Christ had been crucified. People normally kneel under the altar inside the church, touch the stone in the floor, and say a little prayer. Maybe a little prayer for a sick child, to reconcile with your wife, or even to win the Powerball. That's my favorite. But when I kneeled myself, waiting to have a revelation that could change my life, I saw the image of God smiling, laughing, making fun of me, making fun of us, making fun of the races, the nationalities, and the divisions we create. God was inviting me to celebrate the honor of belonging just to one race, the human race. My fellow humans, let's pray. Dear God, we know you see us with a different set of lenses, the lenses of inclusion and compassion. Please help us to erase divisions and prejudice from the face of the earth. You taught us that we are humans not because we have the capacity to think, but the ability to love. And God, don't forget to protect the diplomats. Amen.
So now with our program for today, I am delighted to welcome the co-chair of the Diplomacy Task Force for our club, David Woodward, who also serves on our board. David is going to remind us what Diplomacy Day is all about and introduce some additional special guests. So I'm turning it over to you, David.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, this is an exciting event. This is our second annual Diplomacy Day. Many of you were here last year, and so I think it's a really exciting accomplishment for our organization that we've sustained this momentum, and our Diplomacy Task Force now has 47 club members in it, and we've surveyed those members and found how much global expertise you have, languages that you know, and places you've traveled and lived. So our club is a very international club, and it's becoming more so. So we're very proud of that, and we find this to be a very important thing, and just came back from DC last night, and I can tell you it is actually a very, very important thing. So we're doing something very, very worthwhile here. 3 years ago, I invited Director General Andy Chin of TICO, Taipei Economic and Cultural Office, to visit Rotary, and he looked around and he said, wow, this is great. How often do you meet? I said, every week. He goes, can I be a member? And I thought, this is a strange question. Why is this important individual in our community asking me if he can be a member? And so we began to learn about what the Consular Association of Washington, the Consular Corps, how it's constituted. There are almost 60 countries represented in Seattle, and almost no one in the region knows this. So we are really at the forefront of helping our region, our community, value the diplomats that are here in the Consular Association. There are actually over 60 members. So we've begun a close collaboration with the Consular Association of Washington. Pedro is the president of that. He is also the co-chair of the Diplomacy Task Force. So very fortunate to have him as a Seattle Rotary member. And we're also interested in how this might impact the whole district of Rotary. And so we're thankful for the Linwood group that's here today, showing a real serious interest in this. So our purpose is broader. It's to reach out across cultural and linguistic lines to all members of our community. It isn't purely about diplomats and politics. It really extends to expat leaders, people from all over the world that are moving into this region, making it a more and more diverse place, and figuring out how do we reach out to them, how do we make them welcome, so that when someone comes in the door, they really feel valued and appreciated. So we held our first Diplomacy Day a year ago, and I would just say that in that year, as I've thought a lot about this, and a few things have happened in our society in the last few months, you know, I think that the importance of diplomacy is certainly increasing. The whole nation, I could just tell you, having come back from Washington, D.C. last night, it's very interesting. The whole nation is really watching Seattle and the state of Washington in a way it never has, I don't think. And so here we are having Diplomacy Day today, and I'm very excited about that. And I think the rest of the country is going to look to us for leadership in this regard. So I'd like to thank the Diplomacy Task Force members, and then I want to particularly now introduce the Blue Ribbon members of the Diplomacy Task Force, first of all. It includes 6 Consular Association members who are current members of our club, and 4 regional leaders who assist our task force in liaising to the City of Seattle, the State of Washington, the 5030 District, and Sister City Association. They are, I mentioned Pedro, Masahiro Omura, Consul General of Japan. If you could just stand as I call your name. James Hill, Consul General of Canada. Duck Ho Moon, Consul General of Korea. Roberto Dondish, Consul General of Mexico. And representing the Blue Ribbon member, Director General Vincent Yao of Taiwan, is Vice Consul Sophia Chi. And we also have, as I say, the regional leaders, Deputy Mayor Hyuk Kim of Seattle, our liaison to the city. We have Ralph Monroe, former Secretary of State and past Rotary President. Where is Ralph? Did he stand already? There he is. And we have Ezra Tashome, Ambassador to the district, and he stood. And we have Burton Bard, who is the Sister City President of Seattle. So thank you all, and let's give them a hand for the Blue Ribbon members. And then I'd like all the Diplomacy Task Force members in the room, if you could all stand as well. Anybody who is on the Diplomacy Task Force, please stand. Thank you all so much. Finally, we will have a after party tomorrow, which I'll be hosting at Ivers Acres of Clams at Pier 54, 5 to 7 p.m. So if you're interested in the topic and you'd like to talk more about it, please come tomorrow to the after party. Everyone's welcome to that. And so now we're going to turn to several members of the Blue Ribbon Task Force for the short program, starting with Consul General Omura of Japan, and he'll take a couple minutes to talk about some of their initiatives. And here's the, you can just sit at the, you can stand, please. Yeah, stand and seat and speak.
Good afternoon. I'd like to talk about some of our activities lately. Most recent event I organized was promotion of Japanese rice wine, sake. Yesterday, we invited local restaurateurs and distributors to a sake tasting. Secondly, I am now promoting understanding towards development of Mitsubishi Regional Jet, MRJ, in Washington State. Mitsubishi opened engineering center in Seattle and the flight testing center in Moses Lake. They are employing 500 people, and half of them are locals. Lastly, the most popular achievements we made lately was the mutual partial exemption of driver's license examination. This is an initiative very popular, and a good number of Japanese residents are making good use of it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. I spent almost 3 years here. As you may imagine, I have a couple of caps as career diplomat here. I have 2 points today. The first one is my efforts to engage our Korean companies and businessmen to look Seattle, a very good, beautiful city, but city of invention and innovation. But this is not very easy game. So I really think that our Trans-Pacific trade and investment will be much more important in the years to come. So I would also ask our Rotary members to look East Asia policy, to have your East Asia policy. We need to interact more. My second point is about my mission's efforts to build our own government building in your beautiful city. As was very well known, we have made many efforts to obtain construction permit from Seattle City. Deputy Mayor Heo Kim was very helpful in granting this kind of a permit, and we have secured our construction fee. We are now just selecting a good local constructor to build our building in lower Kinan area. So this will be a landmark building for any foreign government to have purchased their land and to build their own building. With this infrastructure in Seattle, I think South Korean government and its people, and also our community of more than 100,000 Korean immigrants will be living your Seattle history. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is really an honor for me to be part of the diplomacy today. And I know a lot of you must have heard of Taiwan, especially. I would say thank you, especially thanks to President Kathy Gibson and David Woodward, and a lot of volunteers in Rotary, that we got a Taiwanese youth ambassador delegation coming to have lunch and perform in Rotary last September. And a lot of people said that they learned a lot from you, so I will say thank you for hosting them and giving them the most unforgettable memory last September. And also I would like to take this opportunity to share with you the current policy that our government is promoting 5 innovative industries, which include green technology, biomedicine, national defense, Asian Silicon Valley, and smart machinery. I know such a smart city like Seattle, a lot of people must be engaging in business like this. So we welcome you. If you want to reach out your business to Asia, to Taiwan, feel free, welcome to contact us. We would be more than happy to connect you with Taiwan. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Mayor Ed Murray, I want to first of all say thank you to Seattle Rotary for this kind invitation for us to participate as a city on this very important Diplomacy Day. I was here about last year, and I don't think then we quite grasped how starkly important it would be for us as a city and a nation to embrace diplomacy as a tool for not only people to people, but country to country, economy to economy relationships to deepen and to continue. And I think that one of the things that Mayor Murray has really championed since coming into office over 3 years ago, has been the fact that as we see our federal and to a lesser extent state governments shrinking in their duties, shrinking in their resources available, it's really up to cities to forge those relationships, whether they be economic relationships or cultural relationships. And so I just want to say thank you to Seattle Rotary and our Consular Corps for making Diplomacy Day a reality. The other thing I just quickly want to mention is Mayor Murray, after the election this past November, Mayor Murray heard from many in our immigrant and refugee communities. He heard fear and anxiety and concern. And one of the first actions that he took was to establish an inclusive and equitable city cabinet in our city government, which I chair. And really the purpose of that inclusive and equitable city cabinet is to uphold Seattle's values as a welcoming city. And so for all of the diplomats in this room, for all of the representatives of our foreign governments, please know that the city of Seattle is here as a partner to continue the very important work that diplomats do all over the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for giving us a window into what your respective consulates and the city is doing regarding international relations. Well, we're going to move on to our main program today. And when we thought about what the topic should be, one of the things as we look around the world and we have global headlines all the time is we sometimes fail to look at what's going on right here on in our own neighborhood, in our own continent. So I thought it would be very timely to take a look at what's happening here in North America, the perspectives of our neighboring countries to the south and to the north. What are the Canadians thinking? What are the Mexicans thinking? And who better to help us answer that question than the consuls from those respective governments that are here in Seattle. And they've been introduced, and Jill, our member, is going to introduce them again in a moment. When we put this program together, we wanted to do it as a conversation between the two consuls as well as with our members. And to help guide that conversation, I asked our member, Jill Doherty, right here to my immediate left, perched and ready to roll here. And of course, Jill is ready to go because she is a 3-decade-long correspondent with CNN. And she has quite a track record, and we are extremely lucky to have her as a member of our club. She's been here as a member of our club for about a year. And after almost, 30 years, Jill? 30 years with CNN? She's, that's a secret, okay. After about 30 years with CNN, she continues to report independently and continues to pursue some other interesting projects. But today, she's here to help guide the conversation on North American diplomacy. So thank you, Jill, and thank you, Roberto and James, for being with us today.
Kathy, thank you very much. This is exciting. You know, I moved here because, number one, it's a beautiful city, but also it's a very practical place. You know, I like the fact that people have traditionally had businesses and look at international relations, not necessarily in an intellectual way, but a very practical, sometimes business-oriented way. So, two gentlemen that I have right with us, Dr. Roberto Dondich, who is the Consul of Mexico, and then we have James Hill, Consul General of Canada, both from our neighbors. And if you turn on the TV tonight, you are guaranteed to see a lot of news about Canada and Mexico. But what I wanted to do, and Kathy, this is really Kathy's idea, that she wanted to keep it kind of focused on our region. Out here in the Pacific Northwest. So if we start with that, I do want to make some news with you gentlemen a little bit later. We'll make sure we have time for that. But we're going to have about 15, maybe 18 minutes of conversation. We'll open it up for some questions and then some final remarks. But let's begin, again, with Kathy's idea, which is Roberto, let's begin with you. When you look at Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, how important is it to Mexico? Where does it fit in your perspective on the world?
Of course. Well, thank you, Jill. Happy to be here with you, with James. Thank you very much, Eddie, for organizing this. David, for organizing this. Thank you for this Rotary for Seattle to have us here. I think it's very important. You know, when I got here about 7 months ago, I started feeling that this city didn't really get how important it is for the world. Before coming here, I was Director General for Global Issues in Mexico. That meant that I was the head negotiator in Mexico for the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the UN Development Goals. And I can tell you, in those two big processes, people from Seattle had a big voice because of the companies that are here, because of the foundations that are here. So this is a city that actually has a clear voice in the world. I think now the city is realizing it because and the state, because of what's happening. So for Mexico, just to think about Washington State, I also cover Alaska, but let's say Washington State at the beginning. You know, we have big companies from here that have huge investments in Mexico. They're doing a lot of business in Mexico, and they're committed to that. Let's say Starbucks, which has more than 500 stores in Mexico. Their operating partner for all of Latin America and Spain is actually a Mexican company. We have Costco that has 37 stores in Mexico. We have Expedia, which has its Latin American headquarters in Mexico. We have Amazon that has a fulfillment center in Mexico, and it's growing exponentially. We have Packard, which has, right now it's the biggest seller of trucks in Mexico. So, you know, and we get Boeing, of course. We sell a lot of parts to Boeing, but we're also the biggest buyer of airplanes in Latin America. So the reality is that the links are there. The links are strong. We're also, by the way, each year either the first or second biggest importer of Washington State apples, right? And we're the biggest producer of beer in the world. So if Washington State is the biggest exporter of hop in the world, you know, it's a pretty good match in that sense. So that's a little bit of how this is such an important relation.
That's a lot. We could drive to Canada in just a few minutes. Okay, so from your perspective, you know, I mean, you're looking around the world, not only at this region, but where does the Pacific Northwest fit in your world?
Well, you know, to give you some perspective, my last 3 assignments were Libya, Afghanistan, and Kuwait, and that was followed by Seattle. And somebody said, "Why would you be going to Seattle after that trifecta of places?" And it's the point of the fact is that Seattle is as international as any of those previous locations. It has a profile and a depth that is perhaps different in its focus, let's hope, but nonetheless that much more important. Since 1953, Canada has been aware of the importance of Seattle. That's when we opened our consulate general here. And that's when we, and by the way, at that time we covered the territory of Alaska. That shows you how far back we go. But since that time, we have been focused on this region because it is one of the points of presence in the United States that Canada identified as a leader, as a focus for economic, cultural, educational areas of cooperation, opportunity, and advancement. And for that reason, the Pacific Northwest has had a resonance within Canadian-US relations and within Canadian diplomacy writ large.
You know, if you wanted to look around at the world, as you do, not just at our region, but let's say the trade, we ran into some trade problems, and we'll discuss those in more detail, but there are other places that Canada and Mexico could trade with. Could you give us your worldview, not just this bilateral relationship with the United States, but the multilateral world that both of your countries deal in right now? Roberto.
Sure, of course. And I did fail to mention one small thing. the Mexican heritage community in Washington State is 790,000 strong, 12% of the population. So, small detail that you have to, I think it's important. Mexico, during the 70s and beginning of the 80s, had its developing pattern was still based on the logic of import substitution. So we had very high tariffs, and the whole idea was to create an internal market. So if you don't have competition from the outside, your companies can do much better, sell a lot more. And at the beginning, for a developing country, it actually starts making sense until you get to a position in which you're producing very inefficiently, bad, things that nobody really wants to buy, and very expensive. So at that point, Mexico decided to open itself to the world. And we truly took to it. So we are, I think, the second country in the world with more free trade agreements. Our logic is a four-point strategy. So of course, our biggest issue is NAFTA, Canada and the US. That's our biggest trade. With the US, we have around $500 billion a year of trade. With Canada, around $20 billion a year. So it's population of Mexico, 120 million. But we also have to the south what's called the Pacific Alliance. Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico together. It's a free trade area, and it's the biggest producer in all of Latin America together. To Asia, we have free trade agreements with Japan. We are working on agreements with Korea. We were part of the TPP, but of course, we're going to make sure that we have the agreements go forward. And we have free trade agreements with Europe. We're revising it to make it even stronger. And we have free trade agreements with Jordan, with Israel, and with other countries. So that's part of what we do.
Very impressive. And Canada, James?
Canada is a trading nation, much like the state of Washington is a trading state. So we have always been focused on the advantages that trade agreements can provide in enhancing the economic growth and being of a beneficial to both parties. With that in mind, we sort of started in the south with an anchor in Chile, in the Canada-Chile Free Trade Agreement, followed closely by something that preceded NAFTA called the Free Trade Agreement. And that was monumental in terms of a shift in mentality on governments to recognizing the growth and the dividend that free trade agreements have. So that dates us 30 years back. Most recently, let me jump forward to just last week when the European Parliament approved the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. That is essentially the free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union. So from a period of over 3 decades, we have been focused on the benefits that strong trading relationships can provide. And they are not just, from our perspective, not just on a bilateral basis, but on a multilateral or a trilateral basis, as with NAFTA. They produce the type of economic growth that is essential for a country to prosper. If you look just at the NAFTA experience, between its signature in 1994, and it came into force January 1st, 1994, until now, the economic growth between in terms of trade between the 3 countries has quadrupled. That would not have happened on a strictly tariff structure on a bilateral trading basis. So our focus for the last 3 decades has been what is the dividend that can be gained with strong trading relationships and making that trade freer and fairer and of benefit to all parties who are participating.
Just follow, going with what James has said, I think one of the things that happened with NAFTA is that it turned out from a basic idea that it was a free trade agreement into more of a single production area. In the logic that the production lines have, taken to incorporate Canada, the US, and Mexico. So we see, for instance, Canadian mining in Mexico, which then becomes part of cars that are manufactured in the 3 countries together. We have cars that are made in the US, but actually have 40% of its parts from Mexico, and maybe 30% of its parts from Canada, and the same thing in the others.
Yeah. Which really leads into the question that I wanted to ask. Watching the news just last night and this morning, I was reading about NAFTA and how, of course, President Trump believes that NAFTA isn't working, at least for the United States, or maybe in general is not working. He wants to change it. And my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that he wants to essentially tweak it with Canada and revise it in a major fashion with Mexico. Now, the latest wrinkle in this, is what I read, is that Canada and Mexico do not want to negotiate NAFTA on a bilateral basis. They want to do it together. They want everyone at the table. Is that my understanding correct, and why?
Well, let me just say that free trade agreements, they do have a shelf life. So in order to keep them evergreen, in order to keep them relevant for changing economies, they have to be updated. And Canada has a free trade agreement with Israel, for example, and it's gone into a second iteration. So the fact that you want to revisit a free trade agreement or modernize it, as I like to say, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I could tell you just on the labor mobility front, that is a foundation of NAFTA. It's dated. Many of the careers and the occupations that allowed movement across the border that are required these days didn't exist at that time. So a modernization of a free trade agreement, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In NAFTA's case, it is specifically a trilateral agreement. So it's an agreement negotiated between three parties. If you're going to revisit that, you have to revisit that on a trilateral basis. And yes, we understand the perspective coming out of Washington these days, but point of fact that if it's going to be a renewed NAFTA or a modernized NAFTA, it has to be done on a tripartite basis and involve Mexico, United States, and Canada equally. So I don't know if that has all been absorbed and filtered in yet, but the renegotiation isn't imminent. We still have some key appointments to be made from USTR on down. There is a study period of 6 months. So we are looking at something in the shortest term, perhaps a year out. But when that happens, it has to happen, if it's going to be a modernized NAFTA, on a trilateral basis and not a bilateral basis, then it isn't NAFTA.
I'm presuming you agree.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's, absolutely, also in the modernization part of it, versus NAFTA doesn't include electronic commerce, something that it's a little bit important for Seattle area. So it's, that's part of what we can make sure. In our view, what we want in the logic of modernizing NAFTA is to make it stronger. And we wanted to make sure that it's NAFTA, that it's a North American agreement. And that's because in our, for Mexico, and this is very important for many people that maybe haven't followed this, for Mexico, taking the decision of joining NAFTA was a very difficult one. I was reading the other day, because I went back to read Robert Pastor, of course, who was a professor at American University, and he was maybe one of the biggest thinkers of North America. There's a book he wrote in the 80s, and to paraphrase, it basically said, the more the U.S. pushes for a free trade agreement with Mexico, the more you can be sure that Mexico is going to say no. And that was in the 80s, right? And then a decision was taken in Mexico to be true part of North America. And that decision included everything. Working together on security issues, working with Canada, we had an amazing experience for a long time in the multilateral field. But it's part of working together in all areas. And that's what Mexico joined. So for us, it's very important that it is still a North American.
Okay. I think we're going to move to we're going to move to questions now, because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of them. And then we'll come back, and I want you both to give some thoughts. What do you want? What are your priorities? Whatever you want to say at the end. So could we do that, Ken? We'll pass out some microphones here. And if you raise your hand,
Okay, odd personal question. I'm headed to Mexico City on Tuesday for a conference with entrepreneurs from all over the world. And my question is, as an American traveling to Mexico City, is there any hostility towards U.S. citizens at the moment based on current policies?
I've gotten that question a lot. No, there's not. And people who call me with that question then call me when they get back and they say, it's amazing. You know, they still treat us very well. Yes, of course. Enjoy your trip.
This is a question for Roberto. The trade deficit 2015 number was 40 billion with Mexico. Isn't it important for Mexico to manage the perception around that better? Because that is not a lot of money. Yeah, the trade deficit with China was 350, 400 billion. That is a trade deficit. 40 billion is not a lot of money. Why do you have such a bad name, a bad rep here?
Well, actually, it's a pretty good one. What they're, you know, what people who are coming out with this are saying Mexico is much more efficient. And it's actually, I mean, if you hear what you hear, it would happen. You would think that Mexico is already a developed country, that we have no poverty, that it's doing amazingly. We're still a developing country. We have a lot of issues that we have to solve internally. So yes, there is a perception, but the reality is that when you bring facts and you start looking at them, it's a different image, but it's a difficult time to talk about facts in that sense. And, you know, even if you look at the deficit, and this is where it's very interesting, the joint production systems that we have make it very difficult to really measure how much of whatever is traded is created in one or another country, and where do you put it in measuring it. So I would think that it's even a lower deficit than that one, but it's very difficult to get to that. But it's a very good question.
I'm not sure you can answer this or not, but in the case of Canada last week, your leaders met with the president and so forth, and how did they feel that meeting went? And secondly, for Mexico, our leaders are in Mexico City today, meeting with your folks, and what's kind of on that agenda? Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, let me answer last week in Washington question. From the Canadian perspective, it went as well as it could have. You bear in mind the rules of the game are very fluid these days. So we're dealing with situations where walking into them, you're just not quite sure where the anchors are and where the pillars are, and have they shifted or have they moved. And in those circumstances, I think we were very clear and had a very productive relationship or interface between the Prime Minister and the President. It's not that they agreed on everything. I think Canada set out its marker on where we stand on immigration, what our views on refugees are, where our perspective on trade is. And in the end, we walked away thinking, well, you know, as a first foray into Washington, that went well. You know, what is the follow-on from that? You know, again, we continue to be very, how shall I say, focused on daily developments. And to the point where Canada's relationship with the management of the relationship with the U.S. has changed. You know, we've developed strategically different mechanisms and type of cabinet committee on relations with the U.S., which we hadn't had for a long time, a pseudo war room to deal with the emerging shift and change in policy, to be much more focused on dealing with the reality of this administration. Because in the end, that's our partner, that's the government that is leading your country for the next 4 years. So we have to find the best roadmap, best way forward to make sure the benefits for Canada and the relationship remains productive and strong. Different, but equally valid.
So yeah, Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Kelly are getting to Mexico at some point today. And it's going to be a very interesting meeting. Part of what Mexico has said is, okay, let's sit together and let's talk about everything. every aspect of our bilateral relation, because it's so deep. And one of the things that we have to make sure is that these are new secretaries taking positions, and they still have to understand a lot of what we do together and how it works together. And that's a very important issue to look at. The other thing that one of the points that we're going to make that it's very clear the President has said is, when we talk about issues, for instance, regarding immigration, we have a different view. Our view is, for the past 5 years, more Mexicans have gone back to Mexico than come to the US, which is not necessarily the case for people from Central America. Our view is that if that's an issue for the US, the best thing that Mexico and the US can do is to invest together in developing the economies of the Central American countries. The better those economies do, the less people are going to have to get out, or want to get out. And that's exactly what we want to do together with the US in working. The reason more Mexicans are returning to Mexico is because our economy is doing not bad. Not great either. We haven't had the percentage increases of others, but not bad. So, people don't want to leave their families. They want to stay where they can make a living and enjoy life.
And I see a question over there. Yeah.
You mentioned the climate change agreement, and there's quite a history, at least between Canada and the U.S. regarding climate change, going back to the acid rain days, and now in the Pacific Northwest, more an issue of water pollution on the Canadian side, or lack of sewage treatment on the Canadian side in the Puget Sound area. Would you comment on what the strategy will be going forward, and what's Mexico's role in climate change?
Well, just quickly, in terms of climate change and the government position on where Canada is going on climate change, that has shifted quite dramatically between the current administration, which is in power just over a year, and the previous administration. I think we were generally labeled as laggards, I guess that's a good enough word, in terms of the climate change file. Indicative of how dramatically that has changed, the new minister responsible for environment has the title Minister of Environment and Climate Change. So it's a recognition that not only do we have to up our game, but we have to be leaders in that, and we have to work with counterparts like Mexico and other countries to push forward what has been agreed on a global basis in terms of protecting the global environment. And there's a strong role for all to play. So again, I think we were much more on the same page with that with your previous administration, and it's watch this space with the present one.
So Mexico is probably one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. What was it, 3 years ago, we were hit simultaneously for the first time in history with two huge hurricanes, one from the Pacific, one from the Atlantic. The kind of change that we're seeing really makes it that we are committed, and this has been true for different administrations and different parties in power, committed to working on reducing emissions. And when in the negotiations, not only did we presided over the COP16 in Cancun, where the whole process was put in track, but actually at the end, I can tell, I was setting those negotiations, there are always a group of 20 countries at the end of 10 countries, and at the end of the negotiations, Canada certainly was there, of course, and Mexico was there. And in our view, we are a little bit of the country that brings together the developing world with the developed world. Because in climate change, the whole division between developed and developing was the reason why Kyoto couldn't go forward. We had to bring a new reality. And this reality is that we all have to do the best that we can. And that's what the Paris Agreement is. And Mexico is showing it by example. So for instance, we're the first developing country to have said that by 2026, we're going to hit our peak of emissions. Even though our economy is still going to be growing, we're going to peak in emissions in 2026 and then go down. No other country has come, a developing country has come out with this commitment. And we're doing it. We're doing it, and we're not going to do it alone. We're working very closely with California, and we have worked very closely with Quebec as well, and some other provinces. And now the idea is to work with the whole Canadian government, which let me tell you, James is not going to tell you, but when their Minister of Environment and Climate Change came to Paris with the new government, and she walked in, the whole room stood up and started clapping. Because Canada's role is also very important in this issue. There was a big push to get the Paris Agreement going forward.
Okay, so we have, I'll steal this for 2 seconds. So we're going to wrap up. Great questions, thank you. And we have like, what, couple of minutes, Ken, for each? Okay, you're experienced diplomats, you can talk fast. And so we have a couple of minutes, seriously. Just say whatever you want. What's your message?
Okay, let me bring it back to sort of the Pacific Northwest and why we are here, why Canada, in its 12 points of presence in the United States, has continued to maintain a diplomatic post here in Seattle. And that's the belief that this region has incredible potential in terms of its economic development, and in doing so, in an economic development in tandem or in orchestration with Canada. You have heard about the Cascadia Initiative. That's something that we believe in very strongly. Governor Inslee just had an announcement on that a few days ago. Last September, Premier Clark and Governor Inslee signed an MOU furthering the Cascadia Initiative. That's picking up on the dividend of many things, of the dividend of free trade, of the dividend of policy alignment, the dividend of economic integration, building a stronger region, which in this case just happens to have an international border running through it. So the focus for us, and what I want to leave with you, is that yes, this is very much an international region, but it has an international region that is going to grow on a regional basis, and that is going to be the legacy of development in the Pacific Northwest. It'll be anchored by what happens between Canada and the US in the Pacific Northwest, and an expansion of the reality of what will become the reality of a vibrant and ever-growing Cascadia region. So international around the world, in North America, a region that has a vibrancy and that has economic growth, and that involves Canada in the US.
Thank you. So, we seem to be far, but the reality is that Mexico City is closer to Seattle than New York City is, but around 200 miles. So, I think we're getting closer in many ways. There are more than 105,000 jobs in Washington state that depend directly on trade with Mexico. As we go forward, energy requirements throughout the Northwest are going to be well met by working the three countries together. So let me be very clear in the logic that Mexico is committed to having a strong North America. We believe that the better Canada and the US does, the better Mexico does. And the better Mexico does, the better Canada and the US does. And we truly believe that's the way going forward. And we're going to try to work in that logic to the limits of what every country, of course, can do. And always, and this is very important, always understanding that we have to do it with respect, that we have to do it with consideration to the understanding of the people who live in the other country, and always remembering that we're talking about the lives of people here. And as long as we have that in mind and we keep on working, we are sure that this is going to be something that is just the beginning. And just the last point, if I can do a small commercial, we're going to have the Mexico Week in Seattle in September, and we're going to get you more information, and hopefully all of you can join us in the events that we're going to have.
I just want to add one thing, and it's not just the President of the United States who likes to communicate in 144 characters on Twitter. We're very big social media supporters and have adopted that format as a way to disseminate that message about what we're doing in Canada, what we think is going on, what's important in the Pacific Northwest. So I encourage you to follow either myself on Twitter. Roberto also has a good feed. We also have a Canadian consulate Twitter page that keeps you updated on interesting things like the Prime Minister's visit in Washington last week. And you can like us or love us on Facebook in French or in English, so I welcome you to do that.
Excellent, excellent. Merci, thank you. Y gracias, muchas gracias. Fantastic. I'm more educated after this half hour. So Roberta Dondish and James Hill, thank you very much.
And thank you, Jill. Well, we're going to wrap it up. We're going to go global again, and I'm delighted to welcome our member, Ross Stewart, to offer some final thoughts. Ross serves as the Dean of the Seattle Pacific University School of Business, Government, and Economics. So, Ross, take us home.
Thanks, Kathy. It's been a great event. Thank you to the Consular Generals and to other diplomatic task force members here today. But, you know, for me, I first learned about Seattle in 1962 with the World's Fair. I was a small kid growing up in New Zealand, and it really put Seattle on the world's map. And Seattle, indeed, has just aspired and continued to grow into being a global city. And so we're thrilled to be here today. Thank you for Rotary is a global organization, so it makes sense to be talking about global events. And so just thanks to the Consular Generals, thank you to the Diplomatic Task Force for putting on this event today. And we are indeed in an interconnected, interdependent world. And these folks are the connectors. And so our civic, public, and private civil society organizations here in Seattle are very dependent on you, and so we appreciate you being here. Thanks again to President Kathy, and thanks to the Diplomatic Task Force, and we're very honored to have you in our presence today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ross. I also want to thank all of our program participants, our special guests. You're invited to stay for a photo if you're part of the Diplomacy Task Force or you're here as part of Diplomacy Day. Please gather up in front. We're going to have a quick photo op. My call to action today, twofold. One, we heard Arnie play the song, It's a Small World. Let's make it a small world. And two ways we can do that. If you haven't had an opportunity to greet, if you're a Seattle Rotarian and you haven't had an opportunity to greet one of our visitors today, before you leave today, please go up and shake their hand and get acquainted with them. And then we also want to make it a small world across our community. And next week is Rotary Community Day. So please extend an invitation to your non-Rotary network to come. We're going to be a community lunchroom next week where we're going to have a dialogue with the mayor. So we're adjourned until then.